I'm Carmine Gallo speaking with Harvard historian and Pulitzer Prize winner Fredrik Logevalle, author of the new book JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century. Fredrik, professor, congratulations. Nicely done.
Well, it's kind of you to have me on. Thank you so much. It's good to be here with you.
Looks like, so this was published by Random House, and I've got to say, just as a hardcover book, it's impressive. It's very, well, it's beautifully written, but the pages are really nice. I think this would make for a very good gift book too, I think, for people.
Well,
if you want to
yeah,
give it to someone as a gift.
I agree with you. I was just thrilled when I saw the book. And so hats off, as I've said to them, I don't mind saying here, hats off to the design team at Random House. I think it turned out really nice. And you know, one thing I'll just say is that I liked when the photographs are interspersed in the text rather than being gathered together, you know, in the middle of a book. And they were totally fine with my desire to have them come up, yeah, here and there as you're reading about them.
Oh, very nice. Look, when I buy a hardcover book, especially if it's a history book that I want to refer to for a long time, and I want to put it on my bookshelf, I mean, it's got to be a nice book. So this,
Yeah.
Congratulations. Now, tell me, Fredrik, this is part one of a three-part series?
Two-part.
Okay, two-part. So this
Two-part.
takes us up to the age of 39.
Yeah, it takes us to the end of 56. He's almost selected as Adlai Stevenson's running mate, a very dramatic story that I tell at the end of the book. And then at the very end of this volume is when I argue he makes the big decision, which is I'm running in 1960 for the big prize. And then volume two, yet to be written, will be the long campaign for the presidency, his abbreviated term in the White House, and of course his assassination.
Fredrik, why are we, more than 50 years after JFK's death, why are we endlessly fascinated by this man?
You know, I've asked myself that a lot, of course, and I think, you know, I'm sure it's partly the assassination. I mean, it's a terrible thing to say, but I do think that we have the Zapruder film. We've all seen the thing. It's sort of on an endless loop in our lives, and he seems always young and handsome. Jackie is there with him. So I'm sure it's partly wrapped up in the timing and the manner of his death. There's also something about the glamour of the White House. I think it's something about his charisma and his charm. But I also think that we are wrapped up in this man, as you put it, for another reason, which is more substantive. I think that he spoke to a moment, and he represented a moment when it was possible to believe in politics, possible to believe that government, though it won't solve all of our problems, nevertheless has a really crucial role to play. He spoke about the need for public service. There's an idealism there, together with a certain pragmatism that we can discuss, but that I think is also part of the answer to your question.
You have a quote that relates to this. You say, through his magnetic leadership and inspirational rhetoric, he elevated Americans' beliefs in the capacity of politics to solve big problems and to speak to society's highest aspirations. That's what we look for in leaders.
Yeah.
And I think they're rare. They're just, that's why I write about leadership. That type of inspirational leadership is rare, not just in politics, just in general.
Yeah, I so agree with you.
Yeah.
I so agree with you. And I also think, I don't know whether you agree with this, but I think in this country, I think we Americans, all of us, we need to reconnect with civic life. And I think Kennedy is an example, and the Kennedy era is an example of a time when one could do that.
If you can see this, Fredrik, can you see my sticky notes?
Yeah, I can.
So all of these notes represent portions of the book that have to do with Kennedy's eloquence, writing skills, public speaking skills, his reading, love of poetry and love of books. You mentioned charm. Okay, so charm is an elusive quality that's hard for me to write about, frankly, because what is it exactly? Well, after reading a book like this, I think that charm and eloquence go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Tell me
Yeah, I
about
mean,
JFK's eloquence.
well, I think that's a really interesting observation, and you've written a lot about this stuff and you've talked a lot about it. So I'd really like to hear you sort of pontificate on this. But I'll say that, you know, it's an interesting kind of evolution in Kennedy. He was not originally an effective public speaker. In fact, he was quite fearful of the prospect, as I'm sure are many beginning politicians. I don't have the sense that at Harvard as an undergraduate, he particularly relished public speaking, although we have this one recording, which I write about, that Harvard archivists found just a few years ago. It's from 1937. And we can actually hear, anybody can hear, this young 20-year-old Jack Kennedy speaking in a class that's actually on public speaking. So he was interested in this. But I do think partly through hard work and his intelligence and listening to other great speakers, he paid a lot of attention to Churchill, maybe in particular. He trained himself to be able to address small groups and then larger groups, but it was not something that I think necessarily came naturally to him. It's really interesting.
But see, that's fascinating to me, and I think that should serve as an inspiration for so many other people. That through, obviously, he had a curious mind and a great intellect, but it's through learning the craft of speaking that he himself became a better public speaker, and one that we needed, because I'm sure you'll get into it in your next book, but the whole moon landing and the Apollo moon mission, that was a challenge of communication and inspiration. You mentioned that, well, first of all, I want to get that link on the 1937 public speaking
Oh yeah.
class, because you mentioned it. I didn't know we could actually hear it. I want to hear that. But
Yeah.
you said that Kennedy would listen to recordings of Churchill and study speeches of Lincoln. So this tells me that even at a very early age, he was in love with language and he had an appreciation of words and language.
Yeah.
The man had a front row seat to history. You
Yeah.
write about the fact that, and I didn't know this, he saw Churchill's speeches in Parliament.
Yeah.
He didn't just read about them, he had a front row seat. And you said he was transfixed by his speeches. So it seems to me that, what was it very early on that Kennedy had this appreciation for the love of language?
Yeah, I think it goes back to childhood. You know, he was sick a lot as a kid. He was in bed, therefore, a lot when he was a child. There wasn't a lot to do in those days. There were no, cell phones or video games or anything else. He read. And his mother, Rose, we should mention Rose, she instilled in Jack, and probably would have even independent of these illnesses, a love of reading, an interest in history. I think he gets that much more from her than he does from his very influential and powerful father, Joe Sr. But I think the combination of those illnesses and Rose instilled in young Jack a real interest in books, and he was drawn especially to books, history, statecraft, diplomacy, especially European history. And I think began to say to himself, these great statesmen, these great leaders of the past, they had something. I want to know more about what they had. I want to learn more about what they had. And I think long before he ran for public office, I think this stuff just really interested him. And then we can see, and I hope I trace this well in the book, how little by little he begins to say, maybe I could be that person, and
Yes.
Develop that side of myself.
That's why it is so important for young people and aspiring leaders to read about the great heroes of history, because you see yourself in their shoes and some of the problems that they faced, and how through grit and resilience they overcame those problems. Okay, I'm going to play armchair psychologist here, and I've been dying to talk to somebody like you who knows a lot about John Kennedy. You mentioned it, the books that he read of adventures and heroes and chivalry. When he was a commander for a PT boat in World War II, Here's a guy who most people may not even realize just how debilitating his back pain was. You could really go into it in the book. Uh, so here is a guy who physically has a lot of problems, especially with back pain, and we all know what that's like. He's a voracious reader. He's a daydreamer. He's got this fervent imagination. His PT boat gets slammed, cut in half by an enemy destroyer. And what does he do? He paddles or swims to a nearby island, saving one of his wounded soldiers who was also in the boat by putting the man's life jacket strap in his teeth and paddling and swimming his way to safety. This is ocean swimming. Okay, I have a hard time swimming in a lake. So here he is saving this person in the ocean. Armchair psychology, Fredrik. Is it because he wanted to live the adventures of those he read about? He wanted to live his own hero story?
I think at least, and I am at best an armchair. I don't know what lower than armchair would be, but as an armchair psychologist, I would say it's at least in part that. I do think, and I speculate about this. That's all I can do in the book. I speculate about this as he arrives in the South Pacific a few months before the ramming occurs. I do think that he sees this as an opportunity to experience what these heroes that he had read about experienced, many of them in World War I, he was especially drawn to, which is maybe common for young men or young women of his generation, drawn to those stories about the trenches and about people who gave their lives in some instances in the trenches. But I think he arrives in the Solomons in 1943, reflecting on this. I even think that his desire to enter the war in opposition to his father's wishes had something to do with what he had read about and the nature of those experiences. There's no doubt that it affects, I think, what he does, and even these actions that you describe after the ramming, which is just an incredible part of the story.
He later hires Ted Sorensen, I guess after he became congressman. He hires Ted Sorensen, of course, the magnificent speechwriter. And I love this. I didn't know this. He hired Ted Sorensen for his ability to write in clear and understandable language. Yeah. So well before John Kennedy ever gave those famous speeches that we all know, the inaugural and those other speeches, he was already thinking about how do I communicate my ideas in clear language.
Yeah, it's really true. And, you know, Sorensen comes along, and I give a lot of credit to Sorensen, as anybody would, and other people have done. I'm hardly alone in this. But Sorensen comes along in early 53, just as JFK is entering the Senate, and they form this incredible partnership. Sorensen is that rare person who can both help devise policy and render that policy, you know, interesting and clear and cogent in both articles and speeches. But what I would also say to you, Carmine, is that even before Sorensen comes along, Kennedy is paying attention to this. One of the things that really I found so interesting was the speeches that he gave Jack Kennedy as a congressional candidate in 1946. Skinny, 29-year-old, he hasn't never heard of Ted Sorensen. Ted Sorensen's never heard of him. This is long before they meet. Those speeches, which he wrote, by the way, mostly by himself, they have some remarkable passages. They show me that this, when Sorensen comes along, it's very much collaborative. This idea that it's all done by Sorensen, I don't think it's true. It's not even true with the inaugural address. JFK's imprint, and this I'll get to in volume 2, JFK's imprint on this stunning inaugural address, 1,300 words is all it is, 1355. That's the two of them working together in a really powerful way.
I'm glad you brought up collaboration. The most famous line, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. You make reference in this book that actually came from, I think, his high school days.
Yeah, from his
he made a ton of edits to Sorensen would take his ideas, craft them into language, but then Jack himself would do a
Yeah.
lot of the editing. People
Um,
forget he won a Pulitzer Prize for a book.
Yeah, he did. And, that book,
He was a good writer.
he's a good writer. That book, it would become controversial when it won a Pulitzer Prize. Had it not won one, nobody would talk about it. But because it did,
Yeah.
was this really his own work? And I talk about this in the book. Profiles Encourages, the book we're talking about, 1956. And there's no doubt that Sorensen drafted most of the chapters in the middle of the book. And then they had some professors who helped them along the way, who I talk about. But here again, as you put it, Kennedy's own imprint is really important. And in terms of the broad themes of the book, the structure of the book,
yeah,
I think that's all JFK. And so, yeah, no, I think this is something that we see in him from an early point, and that famous line that you articulated from the inaugural address, ask not what your country can do for you. Yeah, his Choate, and at prep school at Choate, that basic notion was instilled in him. And in those speeches in 46, you see that same idea by this young congressional candidate. Totally interesting.
Well, I'm endlessly fascinated because I really believe that persuasion and leadership falls under communication. I always see everything through the lens of communication. You have to be able to inspire, to rally people to a cause. A lot of people forget that it begins with great writing. It begins with an intellect that's built on history and books and reading, and then flows into great writing before it comes out of anybody's mouth.
It's such a good point.
Yeah.
And I couldn't put it any better myself. One of the things that's interesting, which I don't think it's a contradiction at all to what you're saying, but one of the things I find interesting is that quite often in his speeches, as he becomes a better speaker and a more fluent speaker and a more confident speaker, he becomes very adept at ad-libbing, at departing from a prepared text. Often it's prepared by Sorensen. And what reporters learned is that they couldn't just rely on the handout that the campaign might give before JFK spoke, because quite often he departed from that text. So he became very adept at extemporaneous speaking, but I still think it builds from what you say. It's from understanding how language works. It's from paying attention to this, working really hard at the speech-making craft. And he did. And Jackie, by the way, we should also acknowledge, Carmine, that she is important. She helps to coach her husband to slow down his delivery, because he has a tendency to go too fast. She thinks he's too high pitched, so he also lowers, the cadence or the rhythm of the voice. Jackie she's really important in all of this too.
It's like you said, great communication is collaborative.
Yeah.
You have to work
right.
with others. Yep.
Yeah.
There is a quote in your book that it's my new favorite quote. If more politicians knew poetry and more poets knew politics, I am convinced the world would be a little better place in which to live. John F. Kennedy, Harvard commencement, 1956.
Yeah.
When I saw that, wow, he had that rare poetry and power, poetry and prose.
Yeah, he did. And when I saw that particular quote, when I saw the speech that he gave, just a 5-minute walk from where I'm sitting right now, I said, I got to use this in the book. I got to use this. And in fact, yeah, it's where I think I close a particular chapter with that line. But I think this is something he cared about. You indicated, I think, at the outset of our conversation that he liked poetry. I think he was really alone among the 9 Kennedy children in having an appreciation for poetry. He memorized poetry. Interestingly enough, he didn't really like for people to know. Maybe he thought it was not something that politicians should admit. But inside, poetry was something that really interested him.
Wow, that's fascinating. So the new book is called JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century. Professor, it's a beautiful book. I hope a lot of people buy it and read it and gift it as well. It's a beautiful gift book. Thank you so much. And now we should be looking forward to part 2. When does that come out?
Yeah, so what I need for part two, and I don't know if you can do something about this, Carmine, but I need the archives to reopen. They have closed because of the pandemic, and so I'm not able to get at those wonderful archival materials. But when they reopen, I'll be right back in there, and then can continue the work on this project.
Got it. Professor, congratulations. Thank you so much for writing the book and also giving me some of your time to talk about it.
You're really good to have me on. Thanks so much.
Thank you.